We're getting some more folks in. Welcome, everybody. Hi, I'm Nancy, and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in a few minutes. You're not imagining things. You are muted, and your video is not going to appear on the screen in this webinar feature that we have here at Zoom. But the chat is open and you can chat to me if you have questions, or if you have if you're having technical issues. Also during Sarah's talk, you can also send some questions that way. And there's also a Q&A feature at the bottom of your toolbar here. It says Q&A with two little word bubbles. And that will give you the opportunity to send some questions, and then I'll monitor that so that Sarah doesn't have to worry about that, and we can get those going. So I'm super happy you're all here, and you can see the list of all the participants. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Great. Glad to see everybody. Good job. Oh, hi, Lenore. Great, got you all. Good job. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Susan. Okay, good job. Hi, everybody. All right, we're so glad you're here on this very snowy day. You can see that Sarah is not in the snow, and I'll let her tell you where she is when she's ready to get started. I'm gonna just put this up here. You are all on mute. Don't worry. We can't see your snacks. Sometimes I want to see everybody's snacks, so it's a little disappointing. Use the chat. Oh yeah, does everyone chat me? Why don't they chat me what you're eating for your snack during Sarah's presentation? Or what you're drinking, right? What you're drinking. Use the chat. For Q&A for, okay, good. Oh, good job, Nikki. For questions. Okay, excellent. Excellent, good job. All right. Okay, we still got a couple more minutes. We want to give everybody a chance to get in. I can unmute you. You want to talk to me?
Sure, if I can just talk to you, as long as it...
You're talking to everybody, though.
To everyone.
Yeah.
So I think I might be the last Jew on earth to break Passover tonight, because we have the very last sundown.
Because tell everybody where you are.
I'm in Hawaii. So we have the last major sundown here. There are like a few islands in the Pacific that are closer to the date line, but I think there probably aren't Jews there. So I feel like I might be it.
And what will you be eating to end your Passover celebration?
And pasta.
Okay, there you go. Good. I like it. I like it. Amy wanted to know how many people are on the call. Right now, it looks like we have about 21 people, which is great. We've had, it's been very interesting in terms of these calls. We've had a lot of people often register, but not a lot of people show up. We usually have about half of the people show up. So it's one of those mysteries of virtual programming that we're all trying to figure out in the online world. And we just want to try to offer as many experiences as we possibly can for folks. If you just joined us, you are on mute, so don't worry. We are at 7 o'clock. We are going to maybe wait 2 more minutes to see if we can get a few more people on. You are also not on video, so you don't have to worry that we can see what you're eating. But if you want to type us a little message about what you're eating or drinking, we would love to know that. Sarah and I are old friends, and food is a big theme of our friendship. So that's really why we're being nosy and curious about your food. Okay, yes, I'm getting here. Oh, someone's having a baked potato. Yummy. It's fun. Yeah, okay. I have a good roasted sweet potato trick, which I'll share here, which is a slow roasted sweet potato. You leave the sweet potato in the skin, wash it, of course, very clean, and wrap it in aluminum foil with a little olive oil and a little salt, and cook it for about 4 hours at 175. It is delicious. It's like candy. So, what can we? I got to give my tricks where I can, Sarah.
It's I guess a Japanese thing, but because of it being a Japanese thing, it's also a Hawaii thing that you just go to the supermarket and can get a baked sweet potato. Like they just eat them for snacks, like an ice cream.
What section of the grocery store are those sold in?
In the deli sort of pre-packaged foods bin.
Okay, near where the rotisserie chicken is.
Exactly.
Okay, very good. All right. Hey, that's why we travel the world, so we can see what different cultures are doing.
Right.
Exactly.
Eating like candy. Like candy.
Like candy, see? It's all good. Again, those of you who are just joining us, I want to welcome you. You are on mute, and your video is hidden in this particular format that we're using tonight, which is called a webinar, which is good for you. You don't have to worry. You can eat and have your snacks and your wine. And if you want to send me a message, you can use the chat feature. It looks like Susan has her hand up, but let's see. Can I get her to chat? Chat. Susan, you want to chat? You want to talk? But chat me a message if you have any questions or issues. And we'll also use the Q&A. Oh, look, there it is. Oh, there you go. Susan, before we get started, Susan wants to know, what's it like in Hawaii right now? Is there tourism?
Absolutely lovely in Hawaii right now. But as far as COVID, the state is locked. So it's very safe.
No tourists?
None whatsoever.
Okay.
So very few cases, and they've flattened the curve to something like a 35-day doubling. But the minute they open the state again, we're in trouble. So we don't know when that changes.
Okay. None of us know anything, as we've just...
Yeah. I know I'm safer here than I would be at home in New York. So.
Yes. All right, Sarah, it's 7:04, so I'm going to introduce you, and then we'll get started. I just want to remind everyone who's joining that you're on mute and your video is hidden. So if you have questions, you should use the chat feature or put them in the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be monitoring those. If Sarah's ready for questions, I'll read them out. I want to welcome my great friend, Sarah Rose, for joining us here today from Hawaii. Sarah and I have been friends for years. We were both involved with the same organization in New York, which many of you Coloradans know, Hazone. Sarah was a great fundraiser and a great volunteer on a lot of our committees. But that's just her part-time activities. Her full-time job is being a journalist and a best-selling author of the D-Day Girls, which is what she's here to talk about. Her other book is also fantastic, which is called For All the Tea in China: How England Stole the World's Favorite Drink and Changed History. It's an excellent book. It's a page turner. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I recommend it all to you. Sarah has written, her name might be familiar to you because she's written a lot of columns for newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal and Men's Health and Esquire and Outside and Travel and Leisure and Bon Appetit, my favorite. So you might, recognize some of Sarah's work. She loves to travel and write about food and all great things happening in the world. So this is, you know, a compilation or of a lot of great work and research. The book is excellent. It's just came out in paperback on March 17th. I know they have it at the Boulder Bookstore, and they will be happy to mail it to you. So plug there, or any other retailer that you like to utilize. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you and take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you guys all for coming. This is the first one of these I've done. So thank you for having me. I'm going to start by taking you back to 1942. And 1942 was a moment in history where things looked very, very bad. It was the height of the German Empire and the height of the Japanese Empire in the middle of the war. Europe is gone. Europe belongs to Hitler. From the Russian frontier to the Spanish border, fascism everywhere. There's not a democracy left except for Switzerland, which barely counts. And England is the last democracy left in Europe, the last Hope Island. And in this very dark, very hopeless moment, a single mother of 3 little girls, gets a call from the government. And she says, and they say, you know, we need you. We need you because you have a skill that no one else has. And we think this could change. We think this could change the entire balance of power in Europe. We think this could defeat Hitler. Would you do it? Would you say yes? And I think most of us think, of course, if I could defeat Hitler personally, I would absolutely say yes. Would we say yes if we had 3 small children at home? Would we say yes if saying yes might orphan them? Odette Sampson, who was a 30-year-old mother, said yes. She was born French, but she was raising her daughters in England. And because she was born in France, she was fluent in French. And this is a dark moment in the war where they needed French speakers. Winston Churchill had this idea. After Dunkirk, when about 200,000 Allied soldiers leave France, there's really like no war being fought in Europe. There's not a single Allied boot on the ground. Everyone's in England, they're flying bombing raids, but they can't even get that far. Their planes don't get to Berlin yet. So early on in this fight, Winston Churchill has this idea, this kind of inspired moment, and he says, you know, people don't like being occupied. They're angry, they're mad about it. What if we could harness the anger of the occupied nations? What if we could turn them into secret soldiers, guerrillas? We could train them, we could give them guns, and so someday when we come back, we don't know what that day will be. Why don't we just give it a name? D-Day. We'll call it D-Day. Someday when we come back, there will be this secret army behind enemy lines, ready to like detonate and explode and help us, because we know we're going to be invading from the sea. And why not? Like, what do we have to lose? There's already no one left. There's already no one in Europe. We're already losing. So he comes up with this idea. And it's the first time in history where someone says, let's make guerrilla warfare our battle plan. Let us build it into our strategic planning for our military. And so this special government department, the Special Operations Executive, is born. When Odette gets this call, Odette, our 30-year-old mother of 3, she is being recruited to parachute behind enemy lines to arm and train the French resistance. And she says yes. And this was very hard for me to make sense of when I first started looking into the story. Why would any mother say yes to this, right? Who leaves their babies? Her husband's already out fighting. I mean, she really could have just been orphaning her children. And she answers in the language of motherhood. So this really got me very interested. She says, look, Shouldn't I do anything, everything? Europe's gone, France is gone. What if England falls too? Shouldn't I, as a mother, do everything in my power to make sure my girls have a place to grow up that's safe and free and full of democracy? And so she puts herself on a line as a mother. She volunteers, and she is one of 39 women who become the very first women in combat. They will be the first combat paratroopers. They will be the first female sabotage agents. She will get into France almost 2 years before D-Day to recruit a secret army, to train them in weapons and explosions, and have them ready for D-Day. And it works. Now, she thumps her head in parachute training, so she is not the very first female paratrooper. The first female paratrooper will be a woman named Andre Burrell. And Andre is 22 years old, French again. They needed French speakers. They couldn't send anyone behind enemy lines who wasn't fluent, native, and habituated in French. They didn't want to give themselves away. So they had to have French speakers, and they had to have French speakers that were permissible to General de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was very worried about becoming a colony of England at the end of the war. Why defeat Hitler if you're just going to have new overlords that you also don't like at the end of the war? So he didn't want French citizens doing this. Andre is 22 when she is recruited for SOE, and she had already been in the resistance for almost 2 years. From the day Hitler marched into Paris in May 1940, she fled south of the demarcation line into what was then Vichy France, and she ran an underground railroad. And once she gets busted on the underground railroad, she leaves, same way she got other people out. She hikes over the Pyrenees, gets to Spain and then Portugal, and then Gibraltar, back to London, says, train me, send me back. 22 years old, she parachutes into France in the middle of the night, and 5 seconds behind her will be the second female paratrooper, a 40-year-old woman whose name is Lise de Baysac. So Andre parachutes in first. 5 seconds behind her, Lise is behind her. Andre will go to Paris, and Paris is going to be the central hub of the Northern resistance. So when D-Day comes, no one knows where it's going to come, but they do know it'll come to the north of France. It will come somewhere along the coast. And Paris will be the central hub for all of the networks on the northern coast of France. All of the resistance in northern France is going to start in Paris. Andre is the first one in to seed, train, recruit, and organize all of the coastal networks. She's number one. 5 seconds behind her is Lise de Baysac. Andre was very poor. She was undereducated. She was kind of like low class and scrappy. Lise, by contrast, was an aristocrat. She was from Mauritius, which is an island off the coast of Africa. It was a colonial possession of France before the Napoleonic Wars, and then England won it in the wars, and it was a coaling stop on the way to Asia. It was one of many of these sort of little colonies that they kept for their overseas empire. And French-speaking, British passport. She ends up in London, but only because she has to leave Paris. When Hitler marches in, anyone carrying a British passport is an enemy alien. So she didn't have a choice. She felt she was Parisian. She'd been there since she was 14. She was wealthy and went to sort of mix with a pretty fast, cool, arty set of aristocrats. And she has to leave the only world she likes to go to London, which is cold and gray and English, and gets there and has to earn a living. It's the middle of war, and her brother gets recruited for special operations to become a enemy spy, and she thinks, well, okay, like her name gets thrown into the pile too, and she too is in that very first class of women who will be recruited to go into France behind enemy lines to arm and train the resistance ahead of D-Day. And as I was researching, I spoke to a lot of scholars, a lot of World War II people who said to me basically, you know, the women didn't do much. like, it's nice that you're writing about them and giving them a participation trophy, but they weren't necessary. They didn't accomplish much. The men were the organizers. The men were the ones taking the risks. The women were all couriers. They were secretaries. And I took that on board. The researchers were all men, but as I was reading, I realized just how wrong they were and how much sort of my own internalized view had interrupted my ability to see what was going on. Lise will end up, she does 2 missions. In her second mission, she will end up in Normandy in command of the French resistance. She is number 2 in command in the French resistance in Normandy behind the beaches on D-Day when the Allies arrived. There was a woman in charge of the French resistance on D-Day, and we didn't know about it. And we didn't know about it for like the obvious and dumb reason that men write war histories and women don't. It's not the only reason we don't know about it, but it is primarily the men didn't see her as a number 2 in command. They saw her as working with her older brother, and he was the one doing all the heavy lifting. So it's important to sort of bracket here. The French resistance, we kind of hear, or we have heard in the past 3 years a lot about like resistance, #resist. We don't really know what that means or where it comes from, but we do sort of understand that it has this storied moment in World War II. And it's important to say that it's become a bit of a fantasy. General de Gaulle, when he is inventing the new France after World War II, doesn't want France to be a humiliated nation, doesn't want France to be treated like Germany, like an enemy nation. And so he creates this story, a very necessary story, that says France didn't collaborate with Hitler. We are a nation of resistors. Everyone was in the French resistance. And this is kind of the sort of storyline he uses to get France a place at the table in the Marshall Plan, in the UN, rebuilding the world as a partner rather than a subjugated nation. Though, of course, France did collaborate willingly. France did send 75,000 of its own Jews to concentration camps. And this narrative paves over France's very real war crimes. But it also paves over what the French resistance actually accomplished. So D-Day arrives. It's been 4 years since there were any Allied soldiers on the continent. And this is the world's biggest secret. It's going to be the world's largest seaborne invasion ever, even to this day. And that night, a signal goes out on the radio, on the BBC, into France, saying to all the French resistance, all the people who had been trained by Andre and Odette and these, saying, this is it, this is the night, we're coming, we will be there in the morning, we need you now. And that night, before daybreak, there will be 950 cuts on railroads and bridges and roads, and telecoms wires will go down, telegraph cables will be blown up. In the morning, Normandy's isolated. You can't get there. You can't travel laterally across Normandy, and more importantly, Hitler's tanks, the panzers that had invaded France in the Blitzkrieg, can't get to the beaches. A trip that ought to have taken 3 days takes 3 weeks because the French resistance made it so hard for Hitler to fight back. And a woman was in number 2 in Normandy when this happened. So we don't hear about it because boys write the histories and women don't. And we don't hear about it because of the kind of failure of leadership with de Gaulle. But another thing is that women's work gets sort of miscategorized. If you were to pick one thing in World War II that changed the course of history more than anything else, that really determines the Allies winning and Hitler losing, you wouldn't go wrong if you chose decrypting the Enigma code, Ultra, right? You've maybe seen the film, The Imitation Game. This was thought to be an unbreakable code, and the Allies had broken it. And by doing so, it meant we could get our convoys across the Atlantic. We could send our ships, we could send our men, we could send resupplies to Russia because mostly the war was happening on the Russian frontier. None of that would have happened if Hitler's submarine wolf packs were still able to attack us. But once we had the code decrypted, we knew where they were coming and we could fight back, and it changes the balance of the war. And that work was done overwhelmingly by women. 80% of the coders at Bletchley Park are female. So men have written this history, and the history they have written is that these nice women clerks helped the very important work of decrypting Enigma instead of actually did the very important work of decrypting Enigma. Women won the war. It was a largely female workforce that contributed to the very most important thing that defeated Hitler. So with that in mind, I thought it was really important to rewrite World War II looking at women, because women were just kind of invisible in the retelling. And as I did that, more and more came into view that we've sort of been thinking about war wrong. I got interested in women in the military because I spend a lot of time in Hawaii. I've been coming here every winter for the past 15 winters, I think. And my best friend lives here. She's a professor at UH. She was extremely generous, and she's stuck with me right now. And I come, I visit, and it's a very military culture, especially where we are on the islands. We're right near the Marine base. And so a lot of my friends here are military or ex-military, and a lot of the women here are military, and they're badass, and they surprised me. I always assumed lady soldiers would just be kind of like GI Janes, like little men, junior men. They'd be very butch. It's a very macho, masculine culture, and that they would be fitting in by acting like men. They wouldn't be fitting in by being in the military as women. And as I got to know them here, I realized how dumb and wrong I was, that they were extraordinarily feminine and female and flirty, and also extraordinarily credentialed. They weren't junior anything. They were commanders. So it defied my notion of how women behave in male spaces, and it also really became an interesting story for me. At the same time, I knew that our US military was going to be admitting women into all combat roles as of January 1st, 2016. So for a long time, we didn't let any women in combat. Every culture on earth has a combat taboo. It says that women and children do not belong in warfare. We fight wars for women and children. So we don't want to put them in harm's way. And it's just contrary. It's just rubs people the wrong way the world over, time and again throughout history and cross-culturally. So it took US forces until 1994 to list the Combat Exclusion, and that just was for lady fighter pilots. Is there much of a difference if you're dropping a bomb from an airplane, whether it's a man dropping a bomb or a woman? 1994, we say women can go into combat in certain rules, but they aren't allowed into ground combat. They aren't allowed into forward units. They aren't allowed into the special forces. That changes January 1st, 2016. The Obama administration has an executive order saying we're lifting all restrictions on integrating the military. From now on, any woman at all who is capable and can meet the standards set for men can take on any job in the military. They can be a Navy SEAL, they can be a Green Beret. And so knowing that that story was coming, knowing that this was interesting to me, knowing that I spent a lot of time with a lot of resources for a story like this, I wanted to find out, I wanted to dig in harder. I thought, okay, so who's the first woman in combat, right? There's always a first, there's always a glass ceiling breaker. Who was it? Who was the first woman in combat? And I thought maybe, I would find a really great Iraq or Afghanistan story. Maybe it reached back as far as Vietnam. And I was completely wrong. The first woman in combat had happened 75 years before. They'd happened in World War II, and the world had forgotten about them. They'd forgotten about them because men were writing the stories, and they'd forgotten about them because General de Gaulle needed his stories to serve his political purpose. And I had to retell that story. It seemed important. And I realized too that we hadn't entirely forgotten about them, because we've all heard of 007, right? We've all heard of 007, and 007, the agency he belongs in, was modeled on SOE, and Miss Moneypenny was modeled on a woman who ran SOE, Vera Atkins. So we'd actually been hearing about them all along, and we hadn't heard the real story behind the story. So that prompted me to write this book. And the Allies discovered, I wanted to know, what do the women do better than men, or do they do anything better? And what the Allies discovered very quickly is that women are much better at this work than men, in part because it requires recruitment. When you are looking for a secret army and a guerrilla army, you're not getting the very best soldiers, you're getting the very worst soldiers. The very best soldiers in France were in jail. Hitler didn't let any of the officers out of prison after the armistice, because it's not a proper peace treaty, it's an armistice. He keeps everyone locked up. He doesn't want them rising against him. The junior officers and junior soldiers were all mostly doing slave labor for Hitler in factories or on the Atlantic Wall, defending against the D-Day invasion. So there are very few men in France at all. And the men who are there are minding the family farm or taking care of their parents, saying to them, hey, leave your mother, leave the farm, go live in the hills, live badly, you may never see people you love again. We need you to do this soldier work, but you're not going to actually be a soldier, and it might not work. It's never been tried before, but do it to free your country. It was very hard to ask, and the women were good at asking, in part because they were kind of raised to be caretakers, raised to be listeners. The male agents who dropped in, parachuted behind enemy lines, had to learn on the ground how to do this work and how to take care of people and listen, and it didn't come to them as naturally as it did for women. And then the other thing the Allies realized is that we've been kind of thinking about war wrong. We think of war as this macho place and this masculine place, this utterly like dude-like environment, when in fact in an occupied country like France, it's almost exclusively female, overwhelmingly female. And to have a woman on a bicycle in France, like driving around with explosives in her handbasket, is not suspicious to Nazis. But any young men of fighting fit age who's doing that is very suspicious. Women had a kind of natural cover to do this work. And this is a story we've learned, again, 75 years later. It took a long time for us to figure out, but we've been having these forever wars in traditional cultures. And places like Afghanistan, places like Iraq, where you realize, you're gonna have to forgive me a sec, the dogs are about to get noisy. In traditional cultures, we've been sending our men in, units of men, and they'll get to a village that is only women and children. And it's kind of a disaster. It's a diplomatic disaster, but also it's very hard for these men to get information out of the women in traditional cultures, to find out any intelligence, to find out where the IEDs might be, who's working for the other side, where the other side might be. If we send the same unit in with women, the women will talk to women. The children will talk to women. So over time in Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned that our guys were safer in these places because war is so female. And it took us 50 plus years to relearn the lessons of World War II that we had forgotten. And we'd forgotten because men wrote these stories and women didn't, because leadership needed to tell a story that wrote women out. So my goal with this book was to write women back in, to center them. Because if you do that, you realize that in fact, women won this war. We don't just fight for women and children. Women have been fighting all along, and we just belong in the story. It's not about participation trophies. If we forget our own history, our guys will be less safe now. Our national security is compromised if we don't remember that women have always been a part of war. So this is where I will typically open things up to questions. So I will now put in Nancy's hands to open the floor. I will also say, particularly when I talk to JCCs, I tend to get a question about Hannah Senesh, who was the other woman who did this. There were 39 women in France, and then there was one woman, Hannah Senesh, who did this in Italy, and she's a great hero. So you have heard some of this story before if you have a connection to Israel or the Hannah Senesh story. Okay, Nancy, take it away. Are there any questions?
Yes. Anita has a question. She wrote, I was very impressed with the Caen, C-A-E-N, Normandy Museum. Is there anything at that museum about these women, and were you able to do any research there?
So I did do research in Caen, and it doesn't have a specific SOE focus at all. I don't remember even if there is a special section for women there. It's a beautiful museum. I recommend everyone go. If you haven't taken the battlefield tours of Normandy or the cemetery tours, please do. It's just incredibly moving, really important part of our history. In France, they don't like this story very much. They think it robs France of its own agency in the war, to have been a kind of junior partner to the Allies. So Britain tells the story to feel good about itself. Look at us. We invented the French resistance, and with our French helpers, and the French frame it as, thank you for the guns and weapons for the work that we did on the ground. So there's a lot of political jockeying about this history, even now. I know there's also a lot of revisionism and pure Holocaust revisionism, in particular in Normandy, where I have had a historian say to me, France didn't collaborate. Vichy collaborated, and that wasn't a real government. And France didn't send its Jews to Auschwitz. Vichy did. And since it wasn't a real government, France didn't collaborate. And that is just kind of straight up Holocaust denial. And there's still a lot of that in Caen, in Normandy. And so there's a way that this story still isn't quite being told, though now where we are with Rosie the Riveters, there's, I think, more of an opportunity for these stories to come out and more of a celebration of what the women did. But it's evolving, and it has a lot of currents that it's swimming against for various reasons.
Sarah, we have another question about the American women. Were they involved, not necessarily in D-Day, but in other spy type roles rather, or were they only at the home front, the Rosie the Riveters?
Oh, they were absolutely involved. So the same work that's going on in Bletchley Park to decode the Enigma crossing the Atlantic, in DC and Virginia are women who are good at math and good at languages and good at crossword puzzles. They're decoding the Japanese codes, and they're getting our guys across the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. So there's a lot of work there that the women are doing and shouldering, and that's just as important. The women who were chosen for SOE, so they're only 39. We have a very low group. It's hard to draw any kind of conclusions about them. The key thing they needed was fluent, habituated French and a not French passport, which meant that they were all kinds of nationalities. There were Americans, there's an Indian woman, there was an Italian passport holder, a lot of British passport holders, Irish passport holders. Ireland was neutral in the war. So it was a motley crew of anybody but the French doing this work. The very first woman, in fact, if you were to pick the very first woman in combat or very first woman in SOE, that role tends to be given to Virginia Hall, who was in Vichy, and by virtue of her American passport, we still had diplomatic relations with Vichy, France up until November 1942. So there's an American embassy there, there's a consulate, she's there as a reporter and has a valid visa. And so she does this underground work as an American, as a reporter, mostly as a kind of liaison agent. She gets money to agents, she meets them. She doesn't do the blowing up stuff, but she gets credit, and she's an American working for the New York Post for being the very first woman in combat and very first woman in SOE. But she's not trained the way the men, the way the rest of her classes are. The other 38 women are given parachute training and paramilitary training and boot camp, and they're taught how to be spies. She just happened to be there, and it worked out that she was useful to the resistance. But yeah, the very first is an American. And she had one leg. She was an American journalist with one leg, wooden leg named Cuthbert. And when she has to get out of France, when she gets blown, she has to walk over the Pyrenees on a wooden leg. And it's apparently quite difficult, and she sends a telegram back to her bosses, and she says that my wooden leg, she says, Cuthbert is giving me trouble. And her bosses right back will says, if Cuthbert's not cooperating, shoot him.
That's what she called her wooden leg?
Yes, a wooden leg named Cuthbert.
Great. Sarah, you mentioned some of the researchers that you had come across and some of the places that you went. Some of them were not great encounters, it sounds like, but I wondered if maybe you could share a little bit about what your process was, all the different places, archives you visited, you know, how you dug up this story.
Sure. So the very first thing I had to do was learn French. I think I might be the only kid who never studied French at all. I had no background whatsoever. So I sold this book in August 2015, and about 2 weeks later, I moved to France to learn how to speak French, which was no hardship. It was some of the most delightful research ever. I ate quite a bit of cheese. And so I had kind of two avenues of research. One is there's the archival stuff, and then the other was kind of experiential. I want the book to feel like a novel. I don't want it to read like an ordinary history book, in part because I think history gets boring. My big realization in this book was nobody knows how history ends while they're living it. It sounds like a dumb realization, but I have no idea how the Trump administration ends. And if you would ask me 3 months ago, I would not necessarily have said, we are going to all be locked in our houses right now. It's a surprise to us as we're living it, but historians write from this results-oriented perspective. So my goal was to make this feel like a book where you didn't know the ending, even though we all know that the Allies win and D-Day is a success. And so I wanted to walk every step of the way that these women had walked, and I wanted to experience their lives and see their homes. And these women were not the best soldiers. When I meet female soldiers in Hawaii, they are actually hardcore and badass. But these women were ordinary, and they were the most ordinary. The youngest recruited was 20, the oldest recruited was 55. The thing they had in common was French, not that they were kick-ass athletes and badass shots, though they became, many of them, badass shots, and some of them were kick-ass athletes. The thing they had in common was that they were just ordinary, everyday women. And so I kind of thought, well, if they could jump out of an airplane, I am an ordinary, everyday woman. Can I jump out of an airplane? And it turns out I can. They don't recommend it. Don't ever feel a need to do it again. So I wanted to embody their world. I took a boot camp. I learned to shoot. I did the kind of things that they had to do in order to become secret agents. And so that was kind of the experiential part. I wanted to be certain of everything I was writing about, that it felt true and lived in. And then the other part was archival. So that is hard in all kinds of ways. The archives in England, very easy to get to, extraordinarily easy to get to. half the stuff is digitized and can just be emailed to me. The rest of it is wide open. They're very much the sunshine is the best disinfectant. Everybody should see these. And they've all been declassified recently. So it's easy in England. France, not at all easy. It is like pulling teeth to get material out of French archives. They didn't apologize for the Holocaust until 1992. They still haven't really reconciled with their role in the war, and they don't want more information coming out right now while there's still people around who could be hurt by it. So very hard to get information out of France. I think we will continue to get more. We're in this phase of history right now where the very last survivors are dying day by day. And we are in this transition from World War II going from lived history and living memory to past history. As it becomes past, as there's nobody left with like skin in the game, I think we're gonna find more about France, and France will reconcile more with its role in the war. But for the moment, there was a real break between what I could get out of the Allied archives and what I could get out of French archives. It's hard for lots of reasons to write about spies, in part because a really good spy won't leave a trace. They're not supposed to. Their job is to be invisible. So in some ways, the most we know about these agents and these women and their experiences, we only know when they failed. If somebody died, if somebody was captured, and many people were captured, there would be an inquest. There would be an attempt at the end of the war to trace what happened to them. So a lot of the material we have makes it look like SOE was terribly unsuccessful, because most of the data we have is about the failures. The successes are invisible because spies aren't supposed to write anything down. It also was very hard to find the women in general. This became a big actual contention point at the end of the war. Many of the women, 13 of the women were captured and in concentration camps and died. And at the end of the war, they're trying to find these women, and it was hard to find them. Ordinarily, what you do to find a soldier lost in battle is you put their name on a list for the Red Cross or the Vatican. The Vatican and the Red Cross then goes to the enemy and says, hey, do you have Sergeant Smith? Enemy goes down the list, does Sergeant Smith on the list? No Sergeant Smith here. It's like a game of go fish, but if Sergeant Smith is on the list, they have to hand him over. It was very embarrassing to put women's names on the list. So any man doing this work, any male agent, also had a rank in the ordinary military. He could just sort of like rip the mask off when he's captured and say, I'm actually, Major Smith, and can you treat me with, according to the Geneva Conventions, with all of the privileges of a POW. There were no women in the military at this point, and the women were out of uniform, so they're not covered by the Geneva Conventions. And Hitler had placed an order that if they got captured, they should be tortured and disappeared. So the Allies at first didn't want to put women's names on the Red Cross list. It was too humiliating, which meant it was much harder to find the women than it was the men. And also they were worried that because this was the first time this had ever really been tried, this kind of sort of systematized sabotage, they knew that another war was coming with the Soviets. They knew that the Cold War was on its way. They didn't want to give away this new technique, this new technology of undercover warfare. And so they didn't want to put names on the list because it was a way of also telling the Soviets what they'd been doing. And then another reason was they screwed up a lot. So this communication is happening via radio. There will be a telegraph operator behind enemy lines who is communicating with London every night. And he has a radio, he has crystals that are tuned to a frequency in London, and he has his own set of codes. Anybody who were to capture his codes and his radio crystals, which have a frequency, could pretend to be this radio operator and could have like a dummy imitation game, could send these fake signals pretending to be an Allied soldier behind enemy lines when really it is a Nazi controlling this radio. Radios got captured a lot. And once a radio is captured, you've got a Nazi saying, hey, send me money, send me guns, send me more agents. In France, at least 17 agents were basically parachuted to their death because of this radio game, because Nazis were operating the radios pretending to be allies. In Holland, almost all of the agents dropped in, except for like 2 were captured because of a radio game. Over 50, I think, were sacrificed. So there were a lot of really humiliating mistakes, which also made it very hard to find women after the war, find anybody after the war. So putting together the picture at the end had a lot of obstacles, but it's your job as a writer to sort of figure out still how to tell the story, even with the Swiss cheese pieces of it. And I tried.
And I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
One of a question that we just got, I think you might have answered with, there were only 39 of them. Some of them were hard to track down. There wasn't a lot of information. You mentioned this humiliation issue. This attendee wants to know, why did you focus on, or how did you focus on, 4 particular people, or 5 there might have been, out of the 39? And is that because that's where you got the best leads, maybe?
Well, it's more, they were the very first class. So the war takes 6 years. I focused on the very first class to graduate, and they were recruited in 1942. So they were the real glass ceiling breakers. There were 39 women, but overwhelmingly the vast majority of them are parachuted in 1944, right before D-Day, because that's when they're most necessary. And that's sort of when the Allies had figured out how to train women, how to make it less ad hoc. So I was interested in the pioneers, and I picked 5 women from the very first class of about 8 to focus on. So they were chosen because they were all trained together, they were all in the same place, and their timelines match up. They were all fighting in the same hours. That is how I selected them, but also I felt like their stories, you will have to work with the material you have. Odette becomes a kind of spokeswoman for SOE at the end of the war. SOE is a very controversial, having secret government agencies should always be controversial, and this was no different for Britain. Odette is captured. She wasn't a very successful secret agent, but she was a very successful soldier. So she doesn't accomplish much on the ground by way of her actual remit. She's captured within 6 months of her arrival. But in the moment she's captured, she does this really sort of awesome thing. She saves her commanding officer's life. Nazis have captured her, and her commanding officer is a man named Peter Churchill, and she says to her captor, "This is Winston Churchill's nephew, and I'm his wife." Peter Churchill is not Winston Churchill's nephew, but it's a good lie, because Hitler has given an order that all undercover troops should be destroyed. But the minute she said Churchill's nephew, he becomes a high-value diplomatic VIP prisoner. He will survive the war. And the minute she said she was his wife, she too becomes a high-value diplomatic prisoner. She too survives the war. She spends a year in jail in France, and then another year in Ravensbrück, the largest women's prison in history. She escapes Ravensbrück with evidence that will put the commandant of Ravensbrück behind bars and condemn him to death. So Odette was not a very successful secret agent, but she was an extraordinarily successful agent over time, and put one of history's worst war criminals to death. And so because her story is so great, it's not just that she saves her commanding officer's life in this very dramatic way, she then marries him at the end of the war. So there's a movie made of Odette. Odette gave a lot of interviews. I had a lot of material from Odette that I could work with. So she was sort of an easy one to focus on because I had a lot of rich materials. With Lise lived for a very long time. She lived to be deep into her 90s, and she lived long enough to survive into the era of declassification, which meant that scholars got to interview her, documentarians got to interview her. So I had a lot of oral history when it came to her, because again, otherwise her personnel file is only like 3 pages long. Her work would otherwise have been invisible, but she lived long enough to not just tell the tale, but to have her tale declassified. And then with Andre, he's sort of the other one I really focus on. She's the one where there's an inquest. She's captured. She didn't make it. She's kind of my favorite. But they needed to find out what went wrong. They wanted to trace where she ended up. And so they sent a massive team to investigate how that Paris network went down. So we have all of the information from the inquest, and then we also have the war crimes testimony from the Nazis who captured her and what they said about how they found her and what she did when she was in jail. So it was kind of putting together that pastiche because of they were different kinds of sources, but I could actually make all of their stories cohere. And they were in the same class. So you're always casting a book. You can't tell 39 stories, or I can't tell 39 stories. You need a couple of people to root for, to really invest in, who become characters in your mind whose fates you care about. And I felt like these 3 women gave me the most material to work with, by way of being very different from each other, having very different storylines, and also characters that I could see within the available material and archives that I had.
Sarah, you mentioned Odette's commanding officer, who later became her husband. Was he the person who couldn't really speak great French, and that's why she called him? No,
he had great French. I mean, but it was more, she was just I saw it as another kind of feminine moment from Odette. She came up with a romantic story on the fly that gave her a reason for doing something kind of daring and dangerous. She was like, yeah, no, we're in love. And he's very important. He's a very important person. But no, his French is okay. They were just not very successful as spies. They were a little sloppier than everybody else. But plenty of people who were sloppy spies survived. They were being hunted by very good professional spy hunters. The Nazis were excellent at their jobs.
One of our last questions is, did the treatment of Helene Aaron bother you? And what?
Very much.
Want to let everybody know who she is and what happened?
Sure. So Helene Aaron is one of the women who otherwise would have been buried in this history were it not for D-Day Girls. Nobody writes about her. She is Jewish. She is a French exile from Paris. She'd grown up in the 16th. She went to Sciences Po. She's a very smart, liberated, independent woman. She's a lawyer, and she's Jewish. So she has to leave because France, and Paris in particular, is a very bad place for Jews. And she escapes. Her father was British, her mother is French, so she had a British passport. At that time, your passport is whatever your husband's nationality or your father's nationality. Women didn't get to have their own legal stature. So by virtue of her father, she had a British passport. She escapes to London. She is as French can be, and she is Jewish. So she's recruited, and she's given all the same training that Lise and Andre and Odette are given. And over time, her commanding officers decide that they give her all the qualities of anti-Semitic stereotypes. She's greedy. She's untrustworthy. They even go so far as to say, she shouldn't be in this country at all. Like we should send her back to France, even though at this point they absolutely know what's happening to Jews in Paris. And she doesn't go behind enemy lines. They train her and then they kick her out. They're like, we don't really want Jews over there. And on one level, that is a safe choice. It was a very bad time in 1942 to be sending Jews to France. France is sending its Jews away. But they do recruit Jews. And there are Jews at the very same time who are being trained to go back. And some of them even were given, plastic surgery to have less Semitic features. They would break their noses, or they would get, there's some sort of extraordinary work that they did to make people seem less Jewish. But for Helene, it was just pure anti-Semitism. And what's interesting about working in archives like this, declassified archives, is no one was ever supposed to see them. It's not like the commanders are writing these with a view towards how history will look at them later. They think this is going to be invisible forever. It's classified. So you get these kind of interesting slices in amber of what the war was like at any given moment, according to what people were thinking, what was on their mind, because they're not afraid of being seen or called out for it. This is going to just go down the memory hole. No one will ever know. And so you get this absolutely unvarnished view of what they are thinking the moment they are thinking it as the war is being fought. And these people were terribly anti-Semitic. Britain, as we know, has some major anti-Semitism problems. They're not new. The stuff that I saw in her files was just absolutely horrifying to me. So yeah, I was very surprised. I'm grateful for her sake that she didn't go behind the lines and die. And I would hope that Britain has more self-awareness now, though. But yeah, that actually was the most surprising thing to me. It was just how anti-Semitic the Allies were.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very interesting. Before we let you go, I just wanted to know, maybe you wanted to let people know where else they can see your work. What are you working on? What should they keep their eye open for? What are you thinking about?
Well, so I have a piece coming out in the Washington Post, beginning of May. It's the weekend, or maybe middle of May, the weekend before Memorial Day, in the Washington Post magazine. When I give my little talk and I say how women's work gets miscategorized, the women at Bletchley were considered secretaries, not code breakers building the very first computer and winning the war, because the categorization is made by men. A woman came up to me after I was speaking in Chicago, and she said, I guess I've never really thought about it before, but I think I flew 195 combat missions over Vietnam. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, we were being shot at. She was a stewardess for Pan Am, which had a military contract. And she was, in fact, flying in and out of the combat zone many times a day, taking ground fire, being held hostage. And she was doing it in high heels with white cotton gloves as a stewardess. And no one had ever recognized the work that she had done, putting her life on the line. The pilots got combat pay, they got hazard pay. The women on the same planes didn't. So I thought her story was extraordinary. It turns out there are these kind of sororities of former stewardesses who did this military work, who put their lives on the line for our country, that have never been noticed or recognized. Some of them flew the entire war from 1965 to 1975 in and out of Vietnam. So they saw more of the war than our male soldiers or even our male commanders saw. And no one's ever talked about it because it's a woman's story and it becomes invisible. And so I interviewed a lot of these women, and that story will come out in the Washington Post based on kind of my interest from D-Day Girls.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I just want to remind everybody that Sarah's books are both available at your local bookstore or on Amazon.com. And we have a series of other author talks that we're promoting with the Jewish Women's Archive that are coming up on Thursdays for I think the next 5 weeks. So keep your eye on all of the programs that we're producing and co-producing and co-promoting. I wish everybody good health. Sarah, hang in there. And we hope that you'll be able to return to New York soon and that things will go back to healthier times for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you very much,
Nancy.
everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.